Hi, everyone. This is Craig Zelzer from PCDN Global, back with another live stream episode of the Social Change Career Podcast. It's episode 10 of season 12. We're a little bit more than halfway through. And today we're going to be talking about launching, scaling, and leading a career in social justice, academia, and philanthropy with Sushma Raman. She's the president and CEO of the Heising-Simons Foundation. Hope I got it right. And serves on the board of directors. She's an interdisciplinary and experienced philanthropic leader, bringing over 2 decades of experience in launching, scaling, and leading social justice and philanthropic programs and collaboratives. This includes building the capabilities of grassroots human rights organizations and their leaders. She's also taught graduate courses in the public policy schools at UCLA, USC, Tufts, Fletcher, and Harvard Kennedy School. She serves as a board member at the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights. Prior to joining the foundation, she was the executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy from 2015 at Harvard University. She also has had roles at the Ford Foundation, where she launched and managed a $100 million global initiative to support emerging human rights and women's funds, and at the Open Society Foundation, coordinating a significant grant-making program. She also led the Southern California Grantmakers Association as its president from 2007 to 2012. So thank you so much for joining us, Sushma. And just for people who have not participated in our podcast before, this is live stream. We really enjoy hearing your questions and comments. And throughout the episode, particularly in LinkedIn, using the comments, please let us know a little bit about your background, your interests, and your questions and comments throughout the whole episode. And then this will be converted to a audio podcast and be one of 130 plus episodes on the PCDN Social Change Career Podcast. You can find it on PCDN Global or any major podcasting platform. 3 quick requests before we get started. Please follow Sushma or consider following her on LinkedIn. Check out the Heising-Simons Foundation. Also, if you like the podcast, please help to rate and share it to help grow our impact. So that's the overall thing. I'm based in Medellin, Colombia. And where are you based today? I forgot to ask you that in our pre-chat. Sushma?
I'm currently in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but
Okay.
the foundation is headquartered in the Bay Area.
Okay, wonderful. So wonderful. And thank you so much for making time out of your schedule to share your wisdom and experience. And I love Cambridge. I went to UMass Amherst and it's Boston. It's an amazing place. So to start off with, can you share a little bit about your career journey and how you tie together all the different things you've done in terms of focusing on human rights and impact and philanthropy?
Yeah, that's a great question, Craig. And I'd love to say that there was some deliberate arc and a plan, but it really wasn't the case. I was born and raised in India, came to the United States to go to college, and was very interested in a range of social change causes. I didn't quite know what I wanted to work on, and I certainly didn't know about philanthropy and the sector, but was very interested in working on a range of issues, both globally and domestically. And earlier in my career, I did some work in the NGO space, which really helped inform my thinking around the role of philanthropy and how it can support social transformation, and both in terms of ecosystems and organizations, as well as individual leaders. My time at Open Society and Ford were really formative years for me earlier on in my career, working as a program officer, both in the United States and internationally. And that really helped me to think about the catalytic role that philanthropy can play in the sector. And having some time away from philanthropy also helped, being immersed in academia, in a learning environment, working with a range of research programs, fellows from around the world, really helped deepen my own kind of learning journey. So I felt very prepared to come back to philanthropy in this leadership role when I was approached last year to join the Heising-Simons Foundation.
And thinking back when you were, let's say, a teenager, or not that you had to have your life mapped out, but when you were a teenager, or let's say entering college, did you envision a particular career path, astronaut, doctor, business owner? And how did you get from whatever you potentially envisioned to, let's say, your first significant paid employment?
Well, I think I was always interested in social change. I don't know if I knew exactly what that looked like. I was concerned with issues of refugees, of women and girls, global development, rights. But, those were formative years, and I did have formative experiences in college that helped shape my thinking and learning. I volunteered at a soup kitchen and homeless shelter when I was in college, which really exposed me to issues of inequity, poverty, race in the United States, something I was not aware of before I came. I did a summer program in the Gambia through a program called Operation Crossroads Africa. I was involved in campus activism. So all of these experiences helped shape my thinking. But I feel like I'm a lifelong learner. It wasn't that at age 16, I thought this is what I'm doing and I had it all figured out. I'm still figuring it out and still thinking through ways in which I can keep listening and learning and expanding my sphere of influence.
And then you've been working on, in partnership with many others on some of the world's greatest challenges, and, whether it's human rights, gender equity, environment, again, across multiple sectors. So can you talk a little bit your experience, the difference between working in philanthropy versus working in academia, and kind of, let's say, not the pros and cons, but what you find particularly attractive about, Harvard's one of the leading academic institutions in the world. So what was it like to be based there for 8 years, helping run one of the world's key human rights research and policy centers, but then also, what for people who are thinking about career, and I'd say the average age of our listener tends to be about 32 to 35, but we do have people in their 50s and 60s and people earlier. So kind of your advice for people as they're thinking about their career, like what is great about philanthropy and what are some challenges? What is great about being in an academic institution and some challenges?
I think every sector, every institution has the opportunities and challenges. And I think what one needs to do is figure out ways in which one can make impact, ways in which you can navigate bureaucracies and organizational cultures, and how to build alliances within and across institutions and with external audiences to kind of help lift up others who are doing the work. So in a lot of my roles, I've seen myself as a bridge builder and a supporter and catalyst of others' ideas. So in that sense, my roles have been similar. So for example, at the Carr Center, we would have fellows who would come in every year, and I would work with them to support their vision, help translate that into whether it's a research program or it's launching a new venture, kind of working in collaboration to support their initiatives while also contributing to the strategic vision of the center. So it's really playing a catalytic role to shape ideas and to expand opportunities and support for people working on important issues. And I think similarly in philanthropy, part of my role is really to think about how to connect the dots between those with resources and those who are trying to impact change, and doing that in a way that demonstrates certain values of integrity, humility, a learning mindset, and a spirit of collaboration. So I see similarities. And, I think all institutions have challenges in terms of, like I said, organizational culture and bureaucracy. But my approach has always been to set the pace, to build alliances, to lift up others, and to stay focused on mission and purpose. And then other things fall into place.
Okay. Can you talk about, from your work at the Carr Center, there's a lot of backsliding on human rights now. I mean, I'm 53, so I remember, I grew up during the Cold War, and then I remember when the Berlin Wall came down. I did study abroad in Hungary about 8 months afterwards, and really, lived in Central Eastern Europe for years. And the early 90s was not everywhere, but was a period of great optimism. We're going to see a peace dividend and more respect for rule of law. And of course, then Rwanda and Yugoslavia happened, so nothing was perfect. But, really, let's say in the past 5 to 10 years, there's been, in many parts of the world, large-scale attacks on both rule of law and human rights practitioners and organizations and civil society. So in terms of your work accompanying and supporting human rights innovators and leaders and activists, what is some of the things that you have seen been most useful, and how, let's say, organizations or individuals could best defend human rights? What are your thoughts about this significant backlash of what's happening in many, not all parts of the world, but many parts of the world, where it's become the idea of saying that human rights should be rule of law should be equal for everybody, and it's never been put into practice, and human rights, to claim that human rights are valid and should be enforced, a lot of states and other actors are questioning that. So any thoughts about, because 8 years of working with some of the top human rights leaders in the world, for others who are working in that space, kind of your wisdom for what you learned about best practices, how to avoid winding up in jail or worse, and and just what that's an amazing experience to be able to do that. So what are some of the things you'd recommend or you've learned?
That's a big question. I think we could spend hours on this. It could probably be an entire semester class. And I think that one thing I will do is put a plug for the book that I co-authored with Bill Schultz. It's called A Coming Good Society: Why New Realities Demand New Rights. And it came out a couple of years ago, published by Harvard University Press. And you can get it at your favorite independent bookstore or at the HUP website. And I look at the future landscape for human rights in that book, along with Bill. And I think coming back to the current moment, I think what you will see is that there have always been cycles, right? Like there are periods of progress and then there are periods of rollbacks. That happens in the United States. It happens in many countries around the world, from emerging democracies to autocracies. And so part of what we have to do is to keep sustaining ourselves, our organizations, and our movements to ensure that we can thrive and flourish over time. I think that we have to think about how human rights are framed and adopted in different places, and the universality of human rights versus, those who would argue that they're specific to certain cultural contexts, as an excuse to exclude certain kinds of rights like LGBTQ rights. And I think part of our mandate should really be to lift up all communities and the notion of rights more expansively. I think the question of philanthropy and human rights is definitely one that intersects, thinking about who sets the agenda, who supports these movements and organizations, who defines leadership in these contexts, and so on, and diversifying funding to organizations based around the world working on, a range of very complex issues. I think, one interesting, question for folks who are thinking of careers in this domain is specialization versus generalization, right? Like, are you somebody who kind of focuses on child rights or, gender-based violence or whatever the issue is? Or do you want to take on a variety of issues and geographies? And, that comes with different approaches and capabilities that you need to think of building, as well as, different career trajectories, if you will.
Thank you so much. And yes, I know that was a big question about, so we have about 50 people engaged watching us from around the world. So again, please welcome to Yachali from Ethiopia, but please let us know where you're watching from, your questions, your comments, and a bit about your work or background, as we really enjoy making this as engaging as possible. So one other question for human rights, I could ask 1,000 questions, but what would you see in terms of the transformation that would happen to the fellows? Were they coming to do research, to do, courses at Harvard, and kind of what happened? Because, I've lived around the world. I've been in Colombia 6 years, but lived in many countries. And often one of the most powerful things I've seen, and my wife, Catalina, we worked together. And I remember many years ago, she came to Bosnia. I did my dissertation in Bosnia. And to see someone from the global majority from Colombia come to Bosnia, like there's been lots of gringos in Bosnia, but like someone who worked on activism and peace and rights in Colombia, talking to people working the same issues in Bosnia, often that peer-to-peer learning and facilitated networks to me is obviously you need resources, but that is often one of the most powerful things. So seeing 8 cohorts of the fellows go through, how did you see the transformation? Was it new learning, new knowledge, new networks?
I think it depended on the individual as well as the effort that they were undertaking. But I think one thing I lift up and give a couple examples also from Heising-Simons is there was a program at Harvard, which also exists in other universities, called Scholars at Risk, where individuals who are fleeing persecution come to the university. They get financial support, but they also get other forms of support. And we had really distinguished people from Uganda, Afghanistan, different countries around the world who had literally just fled with the clothes on their back and then were trying to think through how to continue the work that they do in a new place. What are the supports that they need, both intellectual, but also, just like the day-to-day logistical supports. So that was very, very fulfilling. More recently, I think the example I would lift up at the Heising-Simons Foundation is a fellowship program we have, PEG B fellows, bringing in folks who are underrepresented through our science program. And then I myself have benefited from different fellowships and programs for individuals. I was a fellow through the German Marshall Fund many years ago, at the time that you described so well, where there was a sense of euphoria around the transatlantic relationship, around human rights, democracy, rule of law. And that was really transformational for me as well at that particular moment, to think about how one connects the dots about certain discourses and debates and challenges in a kind of more global context. So I think that philanthropy actually has a great role to play in both supporting organizations and ecosystems, but also the kinds of fellowship programs that can be transformational for individuals, particularly those who haven't had access or would not otherwise have such access.
Yeah, thank you so much for the mention of fellowships. So fellowships changed my life as well. And I've been fortunate to have several, also been rejected from many, and also have served as a fellowship advisor or reviewer for many. Right now I'm reviewing for the RISE Fellowship, which it's from the Schmidt Futures, and they select youth from 15 to 17 years old, the top innovators from around the world. And it's an amazing fellowship. So just two quick plugs for fellowships that many people, when they're thinking about professional development, they think about job, upskilling often through university programs or internships, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of fellowships around the world. And they're not easy to get, but if you can figure out how to build compelling applications, which takes a lot of practice, they can be a great way to upskill, and they're for all different ages. So just, I've had Fulbright Fellowship, Boren Fellowship, other fellowships, and just, and again, understanding this will translate later to philanthropy, understanding whether you're applying for a job or a fellowship, it's not about you, it's about the funder, the donor, or the institution, whoever's providing the resources, and how your skills and experience connect to what the donor or the philanthropic institution is doing. So can you talk a little bit about Heising-Simons Foundation in terms of the areas of focus, and particularly for people who, I'm sure some people listening now or in the future are seeking potential grants or philanthropic funding, and not necessarily say like how to get potential funding from you, but what, as a leader of a philanthropic institution, can you just demystify a little bit the grant making process and how it works, and also your advice for people, whether it's if you take solicited or unsolicited applications, and what happens and how you encourage people to potentially think about applying to donors?
Yeah, that's a lot in that question. And I think I hear two broad themes. One is specifically about the Heising-Simons Foundation, but then the second is more broadly about how you can approach foundations, right, for support for your work. And so I'll start briefly with the foundation and then talk more broadly about philanthropy, but just starting off to say that every foundation is different. So it's hard to say that here's the one approach that works for all institutions, because every institution has its own unique characteristics. So Heising-Simons Foundation is a family foundation. And so, that is a very unique phenomenon in US philanthropy, but I think increasingly prevalent in many places around the world. Liz Simons, Mark Heising, Caitlin Heising are the three original board members. And then they invited me last year when I joined as president and CEO 6 months in to join the board. And the foundation's core programs are ones that were developed by the board, by the family, around education, early childhood education, thinking about how to strengthen systems for low-income children and children of color to reach their full potential, climate and clean energy, to really think about how to address the impacts of climate change, and a program on science supporting fundamental research, and a program on human rights in the United States, thinking about issues of mass incarceration and immigrant detention. And then we have smaller initiatives on journalism and democracy, a local grant-making program, and I also have access to some funding through a CEO fund where I've initiated grant-making around technology and society. So these are sort of the broad brush kind of strokes on what we support, and all of our grants are listed on our website, and we have all of the information there that's easy to access and digest. But I think what's more interesting really for folks is, how do foundations select grantees or set their vision, and how do you get funding? And I just say there's different types of foundations. So there's family foundations, but there's also corporate foundations, community foundations, private independent foundations like the Ford Foundation where I used to work. So there isn't like a specific formula that works across all foundations. But I think the starting point would really just be seeing if there's mission and vision and values alignment between the funder and your work, thinking through who are the other people and what are the other organizations working in the spaces in which you work and who supports their work. Are there possibilities for synergy? How to kind of deepen your impact, build your external influence and leadership so that funders actually seek you out for support, as opposed to you kind of soliciting funding. And that's, hard to get to. And, being part of broader coalitions and collaboratives, as opposed to kind of being in silos, again, to sort of lift up the work and to lift up other organizations, so that as you're working in partnership with others, your work gets lifted up by others in the field, whether in the philanthropic field or in the nonprofit sector, who, identify you as a good thought partner, a capable leader, and someone, worthy of investment. So there isn't sort of a magic recipe or formula, but I'd say doing the work, doing it with integrity, focus on impact, lifting up others can help with expansion of resources.
Thank you so much. And then just quickly for Heising-Simons, for anyone who might be listening now or in the future, you talked about the different areas you concentrate on in the US. And then do you take unsolicited grants, or solicited, or you have an annual competition, or it's different for each thematic area?
Yeah, it varies. And this is something I would like us to move towards, more open sourcing of grantees. I see it really as a social justice imperative because we have a significant amount of resources at our disposal, and I just know, having worked in philanthropy and on philanthropy, that even if we are in tune with grantees and with the field, over time you get insulated. And so I think it's really important to be able to, identify new leaders, new creative directions, new possibilities, and that comes through a more open approach. So we're not there yet, but in the technology and society space, definitely, like, we've accepted proposals from folks. We have a prize, the American Mosaic Prize, where we award 2 journalists with both financial support but other kinds of support, and that's done through a jury. So there's different ways in which the foundation gets input, but it varies with each program.
And thinking a little bit about career paths, when you have been responsible for hiring or hiring others who hire, whether at the foundation or Harvard or Open Society or Ford or elsewhere, can you talk a little bit about, let's say, for a program officer role, let's say, because that would be the terminology at Open Society or the foundation, likely. One is how many applications do you get, and then just what makes for a compelling application. And, because obviously whether you get 100 or 500, you're going, not you, but like the team is probably going to filter out 90% or even more, 95%, say these are the 3 to 5% we might interview. So any thoughts, what makes for a really competitive application, and what you seek as someone who is either helping with hiring or leading it?
Yeah, great question. And I think that, I can speak from a few different experiences, but I also recognize that different institutions have different approaches. But I think one thing to think about is the search firms that work in the domains in which you're interested, whether it's geographic or subject matter expertise. We use search firms for program officer, program director, those sorts of searches. And I think that understanding how search firms work, which are the search firms out there, looking at their websites, if their jobs are posted, that's really important. Definitely, applicants, there's like hundreds of applicants for any position. There are some cases where the search firms actually reach out to individuals. I mean, that's how I was approached for the role of president and CEO. I hadn't actually heard of the Heising-Simons Foundation when I was approached. And then when I looked into them, I was like, oh my goodness, like they have an incredible reach and impact, doing amazing work in areas both that were very familiar to me, but also in new areas, which was very exciting for me. So, don't underestimate the potential of search firms actually reaching out to candidates who they think might be suitable, getting on the lists of search firms that might be seeking candidates. So I think that sort of approach is important. There are some cases where it's an HR function, where it's embedded within the HR department of the foundation. And so part of what you'd have to do is check out individual foundations to see, like, what is the position posted? Is it an internal process through an HR department, or is it through an external party that is handling the search? I think, having the expertise definitely is sort of a given, right? The subject matter expertise, it could be degrees, it could be work experience, knowledge of the sector, knowledge of some of the grantees, perhaps having even worked at one or more of the grantees funded by the institution. There isn't like a specific roadmap. Something I found useful also is the power of networks, having people nominate you for a position where, I often somebody will reach out to me asking about something. I'll nominate the person if I know them well, trust them, I'll nominate them. So having somebody nominate you is helpful because that also builds your credibility. There's a third party who's like nominated you for the position. So, I don't know if I have sort of a checklist of things. It really depends on the position, the foundation. But, focusing on kind of building your own kind of credibility, your leadership in the space, whether it's writing, publishing, it's serving on boards or advisory boards, working on campaigns. And, there are ways in which one works on these things over time. And even if you're earlier in your career, there are things that one can do. I got my start early on an advisory board of a foundation that was interested in funding social justice and social change. And, at that time, I don't think they thought of it as like youth participation, but that's exactly what it was. And that helped in my understanding of philanthropy and the role of philanthropy. So those are just some recommendations. I will say the processes take time. It takes like 6 months typically for a hiring process. And it's never over till it's over. So, folks who are looking for roles, it's just important to keep that perspective that it's kind of a long-term horizon. It's rarely like an instantaneous thing.
Thank you. Yeah, we've had quite a few recruiters on the podcast, so I put them in the chat. Paul Brella from Shortlist, Spencer Campbell, who used to be One Acre Fund, Florence Navarro from Kiochocho, and Dan Perez from SRI North America, and others. You can just go to PCN Global and search. And obviously, particularly if you're mid to senior, then it's easier to get inbound interest where they're approaching you at the junior level, unless you have some exceptional skills such as quantitative or 5 languages. It's harder to get more inbound, but that's really good advice. In terms of hiring, there's a lot of debate. I don't think it's changing much in terms of how important is experience versus credentials, and not that it's either or. But any thoughts in terms of hiring process you've been involved in? Should a graduate degree, is it still generally required, or at least undergraduate, or if someone has really significant experience in community organizing or philanthropy, or are you seeing any trends in the philanthropic world?
I think it really depends on the role, right? So, for example, for our science program, I would say the credentials matter, in addition to the work experience that has taken place, whether in research institutions or in science philanthropy. But each institution is different, and each role is different. So, I think taking a look at um, taking a look at the foundations in question that you're really interested in and looking at the backgrounds of some of the people who work there. If there's people maybe asking for an informal, like 15-minute virtual coffee for advice, or attending events like this to kind of get a better sense. I think, it's hard to generalize because it's so context dependent on both the foundation as well as the role, as to whether it's the education or the experience or a combination of both. I will say that I think that for those of us who have not come from traditional backgrounds, having both helps, because you got to be like 10 times more qualified to get 10% of the space. So.
Thank you so much, and welcome, Natasha. Thanks for sharing this with the Harvard Kennedy School, and feel free to add your questions and comments. So there's been a lot of talk in all industries about that, often at the upper echelons, whether it's the leadership level or the board level, that many institutions, whether it's philanthropic or nonprofit, or aren't reflecting the real diversity of society or societies. And are you seeing changes in the philanthropic space in terms of making sure that both at the staff level, but also the board level, that we're truly representing the communities that these institutions are serving or supporting, or how can we build more equitable and representative institutions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, it was a question that was roiling philanthropy a couple decades ago. When I first got into the space, I was on the founding staff of US programs of Open Society. And at that time, there were debates and efforts around diversity in philanthropy. There was an effort called, I think, D5 or something like that. There's been work on, philanthropic accountability and transparency. So I think diversity is important, but insufficient, because I think, it tends to become, like a numbers thing. And I think part of what you want to think about is, like, what is the transformational impact of philanthropy? How do the internal structures and staffing reflect the external world at large and the issues you're trying to take on? Part of it, that is representation, and then part of that is other stuff, right? You've definitely seen greater expansion of diversity on boards and on staff. But it's a journey. It's not something that's sort of a checklist, and then once it's done, it's done. It's something that takes constant effort. And I think, part of our role as philanthropic leaders is to really think about how to expand the spaces for others, creating more open communications, whether it's with grantees or with other foundation leaders who are emerging, supporting them, supporting boards in their journeys to think through how to be better equipped for the future. So I see it as a journey, not a destination, or maybe it's both.
And any other recommendations? I've been on, I've never a philanthropic board, but lots of nonprofit boards or advisory boards, and and anything you've seen. Obviously, it's all organization and sector and location specific, but these are things you would encourage at a minimum that leaders or board chairs or board members think about as they're trying to build more inclusive and representative and actually more impactful organizations.
Yeah, it's again a big question that I think, could take people with way more expertise than me, as well as, a lot more time on this topic. But I think, don't devolve to seeing it as a checklist or saying, okay, we did this one thing and we're done. Like, so many organizations will say, okay, we added one person on the board who fits X profile. And somehow they miraculously expect that person to come in and transform the place. Or, organizations that predominantly of one group, and then you bring in an outsider like myself, for example, into a role. But then you need the support internally to be successful, right? Like, what are the ways in which you can support diverse leaders in their quest to transform organizations? Like, are you a source of support and transformation, or are you a source of like resistance and entrenchment, right? So I think some of this gets devolved to a checklist, like we're going to do this, we're going to add this, we're going to create a committee. And I think part of it is for people to really take a step back and think about privilege, to think about how to expand the spaces, how to be more reflective, how to nurture leaders, how to be comfortable with discomfort and lean into one's own learning. And all of this takes time. I think there's such a culture of busyness. So taking that time out to learn, reflect, to build, to create spaces for others. I'm also a big believer in thinking about talent internally and how you lift that up. So how do you think of spaces that are less hierarchical and lift up folks who are newer to the workforce or who have great ideas but don't have the job title per se, right? So I think all of that's very important, and it's really incumbent, I think, on institutional leaders, both boards and CEOs, to think about creating more inclusive and representative spaces.
Good, thank you. A kind of a follow-up question: when you think about the philanthropic talent, let's say, need and the pipeline, again, this might be too big of a question, but are there certain roles where, whether it's finance, like certain roles you see across institutions, often they have a hard time getting candidates, and other roles where there's almost an overabundance of applications, because social change and impact requires all the different skills, whether it's graphic design, communications, finance. So is there any roles you would say over your course of your career, often you've seen not as many applicants applying, and like everyone wants to be doing like more the grant making work and less the admin, or you haven't seen that kind of difference?
No. I mean, we just did a search for a CFO last year, and we had a phenomenal set of candidates, and the person who joined us, gosh, has an amazing background, and we're so lucky. So I think there is, not a dearth of people applying for positions, and not just in philanthropy, even in academia, or in nonprofits. I think people are mission driven. I think a lot of folks want to have a job that has a sense of purpose, where they feel a sense of connection to the mission and the values of the organization. So I think there's a lot of folks applying. And so part of what you want to think about is like, what is that value add you have? Is it on the programmatic side? Is it some other skill? What are the causes you care about? What's the best way you can make a difference? And, really think about shaping your application. I can't tell you that in prior roles, the number of things that come through where you can tell it's like a generic cover letter. Sometimes like the name of the organization is not the right name because it was like a cut and paste and there was an accidental kind of glitch in the middle of the letter. So, taking that time to really learn about the institution and the work, and finding a sense of connection between your own journey and where the institution is at, the value add you can provide. I think all of that's really important as you think of putting your candidacy forward, but I don't see a dearth of applications. At least that's my personal vantage point.
For people who are in graduate school or considering graduate school and who may want to work on human rights or philanthropy, obviously, again, it depends on the organization, but are there any skills you would especially encourage people to develop, if they're fortunate enough to have some class time? So is it finance? Is it communications? Is it theory of international and practice of international law? So someone who really wants to work at this intersection of rights and philanthropy, any skills you'd say would likely make that person more competitive?
Again, it depends on the role you want to play, right? So if you're going into like a communications role, it may be a different kind of a degree than, something else. But I'm increasingly seeing people who do a combination of like a JD and an MPA. So you get both the law and the policy. So I think the degree is one thing, but then there's also all the other skills. And I'll just list some that I think are helpful. Actually, this could be in any job, but I think strong research, writing, analytical communication skills are really important. The ability to digest large amounts of complex information and translate that for people in accessible frames. I think so often we end up in jargon filled, bureaucratic language. It's not connective. So finding ways to develop narrative skills is, I think, important, even if you're not in communications. If you're a subject matter expert, you have to have those translational skills. Of course, those interpersonal skills, the personal skills like time management, project management, ability to work across differences, negotiation, mediation, conflict resolution. All of those things are really important. I think increasingly that comfort of working in ambiguity. So many organizations are in a state of transition, whether it's, external forces in the fields in which they fund, or leadership transitions on the board or staff, or, perhaps it's funding changes, political wins. There's so much change happening externally that influences how organizations are positioned. So I think that ability to navigate ambiguity and change with a sense of ease is really, really important, no matter what role you play. And that can really help you survive and pivot and flourish.
That's an amazing comment. It seems like that could be a potential book topic. But any question, how much
my next book topic? So maybe that's
how much do you think that is just innate to how a person is, and how for people, because it's also conflict resolution. It's the idea to have two or more mutual incompatible truths in your mind at the same time. It's really challenging. I mean, of course, I've been involved in conflicts, but also I've been like this mediator where party A says this contract happened and party B says it never happened. So it's like that ability to live in this gray area. But any thoughts for people how to potentially improve their ability to work with ambiguity?
So that's a great question. I went through some trainings. The program on negotiation at Harvard has training. So these are like executive education classes on negotiation, mediation, conflict resolution. And I took some classes while I was at the Kennedy School as well, and also taught some around this at the Fletcher School. And I think that there's a lot of resources out there where you don't have to necessarily get a degree in it. You can just watch webinars, you can read books, check out the project on negotiation, but there's stuff from other places as well, right? Like to research, and then try and think about how you can implement those in your own workspaces, in your own life. Like one concept I really like from the adaptive leadership literature is around this notion of going to the balcony. So if there's something that's brewing in your organization or within your organization and other organizations or your grantees, that ability to go up to that 30,000 foot view and look at the landscape to assess what exactly is going on, what is your part in it, how could you be a bridge builder, a listener, a reconciler. I think those skills are super important, irrespective of kind of like your positionality within the organization, right? Like anyone can lift up these skills and bring them to the table for internal disagreements and external conflicts. So I think that is really, really important because we are working in contested spaces. Very often the people we disagree with are working on similar issues, right? Like you see advocates working in like similar spaces, like working on issues of homelessness or gender justice or whatever. There's like conflicts and political, divides within these sectors, let alone between these sectors and like government or business. And so I think part of our role has to be not just that technical expertise in a narrow domain, but also that ability to bridge divides and conflict. So you mentioned William Ury. He actually just came out with a new book, which I have not yet read, but is on my list. So yes, highly recommend his work.
So William Ury, his book, I haven't read it either, but he was just featured on the Tim Ferriss podcast about 3 weeks ago. So it's really worth a listen. And Daniel Shapiro is often also at the project negotiation. He'll be on our podcast probably next season. He's a longtime friend. And I mean, there are a lot of great resources. One question about the Heising-Simons Foundation, in terms of staff upskilling, obviously it varies by role, but do you have internal, let's say, organizational development people who are providing upskilling, or people can go and choose things with approval? Like anything you're seeing among your own staff, the skills or competencies you're helping them further develop?
Well, I'm still very new in the role, and I feel like I first have to get, accepted by the organization before I can offer upskilling recommendations to others, right? Like, to be heard, you first have to listen. And but I think in my prior role, I could give some examples, because being at Harvard, what was great was the opportunity for folks to take classes at a reduced rate, and also to take classes through Harvard Extension. I don't think I actually took enough advantage of it, but I do know colleagues who actually got like a second degree while working, either full time or a little less than full time. And I used to audit a lot of classes, and so I think, what I will say about what you call upskilling is that desire for learning really has to come from within. I don't think like a leader or a CEO can say, okay, like here's our upskilling plan, and roll it out with a checklist. It really has to be folks saying, this is what I want to learn more about, and building a community that's more learning oriented. And I do have some thoughts in the coming year. Like, we are organizing a couple of convenings, which I think is a great opportunity for both folks within our foundation, but across, to learn. We are organizing a Tech and Society Summit this year for our grantees and some other funders, to really think through the role that AI is playing in society and how to best address this. The foundation is part of a collaborative of various foundations with the White House Office of the Vice President. And so we'll be featuring some folks that are part of that, as well as, other leaders who are working in this space on AI and society. We're also organizing a big event on International Human Rights Day in the Bay Area, which we think will be a great way to lift up some of these issues, again, for a broader audience. So I think foundations in general can play an important role in this notion of not just their own staff's professional development, but also like broader learning opportunities for folks. I think the Ford Foundation does this really well, and I see the Mellon Foundation also doing that. I'd love for us to be in that space in the coming months and years, where we really use the foundation not just as for its financial capital, but also the intellectual capital that we can generate collectively.
Wonderful. Yeah. I mean, since Darren Walker, I don't know him personally, but since he's become head of the Ford Foundation, I just think it's become one of the most dynamic, let's say, forceful voices and funders for equitable justice in so many areas, whether it's film or arts or economic justice or workers' rights. It's amazing. And the Mellon's doing a lot on kind of history and monuments.
Yeah.
I forgot the name. They have this $500 million fund. I don't know if you know the name, but people might check it out, because they've been hiring for a few positions, but it's really about trying to, because it's one of the big issues, and there's lots of challenges in the US, but how do you commemorate history and who gets to tell the story? Yeah. And so it's a really interesting application of arts-based approaches. So in terms of upskilling, is there anything that you are currently working on upskilling, or just learning, or if you had the time, you'd want to learn more in terms of your own professional skills?
Well, I feel like I'm on a perpetual journey for upskilling. My kids have actually forbidden me from getting any more degrees. They've said, no, Mom, no more, at least for the moment. So I am learning through a few different ways. One is by just learning what the foundation supports, learning from the incredible expertise of our staff, as well as the grantees who are supported by the foundation, visiting folks or doing Zooms. So that's sort of one body of learning. The second is our board, who are really incredibly smart, talented, connected leaders really in the fields in which we support. Our board chair is on the Marshall Project board. One of our vice chairs is the chair of the board of Environmental Defense Fund. Another is on the board of Human Rights Watch. So really, the ability to learn from people who are deep thinkers and listeners and experts really is very transformational for me. I think The other thing I do a lot of is like reading, I attending webinars, seminars, in my prior role, I would often attend lectures, audit classes. I think having that openness to learning both about areas one is interested in working on as well as adjacent areas is really important for one's own kind of learning and development. And then finally, I'll just say talking to other CEOs and observing their own journeys, getting advice from them has been very helpful for me, because these are all individuals who've gone through this journey I'm going through, but maybe 5-7 years ago, and have great insights for me so that I can approach the work in a more, intentional and planned way without having some of the road bumps perhaps that others have encountered.
So a related question for people in the philanthropic space or people who aspire to, which networks or podcasts or publications or newsletters, I mean, I'm not talking at the CEO level, but let's say program officer, senior program officer, where would you say these are the most potentially valuable resources? Obviously, it depends on the sector, but if you really want to understand both what's happening in philanthropy and the opportunities and the debates, where would you encourage people to visit, attend conferences, podcasts?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I think there's these, philanthropic conferences, but it seems like all of them are like for their members, right? Like council foundations and all of that. So they tend to be more like closed spaces. So if you're already in philanthropy, it's a great way to network and to learn about some of the trends and debates. But they're not necessarily open to grant seekers or, job seekers per se. I think there's some publications online like Chronicle of Philanthropy and Inside Philanthropy that often have articles that are interesting, that capture trends in the sector. I'd again look at foundation websites. I kind of come back to Ford and Mellon, which I find really inspiring, but also I am seeing Rockefeller doing more of this in terms of like public facing events and activities that lift up the issues that they're working on. So I think that's also interesting to check out these things, as well as, looking at talks that are happening elsewhere, like your local universities, community colleges, elsewhere, other kinds of forums in your town or city, or, online, that can kind of help connect the dots, not just in philanthropy, but also like the various issues that you're interested in.
Right. Yeah. Skull Foundation is also, their World Forum. I mean, to go in person, you need to be invited. It could be expensive, but they have open online registration to attend lots of parts. One of my favorites is not endorsed by philanthropic institution, but Vu Lee from nonprofit AF. I won't go into the details, but he's runs a small nonprofit, but is he's humorous, but also makes very serious points. And again, like Chronicle of Philanthropy is really good. I particularly like emerging practitioners in philanthropy, and Edge Philanthropy. And there's a lot of good resources out there, whether you're in philanthropy or not. So just probably 2 or 3 more questions in terms of, I have friends who work on human rights who, could be or are under threat, or friends who work for reproductive rights where they really have to think about security in ways they never had to in the past. So just 2 thoughts. One, in terms of well-being for people working on these issues, where there is a strong backlash or just actually physical threats. Any recommendations on how do you do this incredibly important work to take care of yourself, both physically and overall well-being, like not burn out, because these challenges are huge.
Yeah, you bring up a really important point, and this is something that I have been personally affected by. And I think that this is not just incumbent on individuals to focus on their well-being, but it's also incumbent on institutions to think about how to protect their staff, how to create environments that are, physically safe, that offer protection on so many different fronts to people who work there to advance the mission. And so I would just caution that we balance that notion of individual well-being with that notion of institutional kind of accountability, right? And that's where sometimes we fall short. But in terms of individual well-being, I think, it's kind of a journey for me as well. I can't say I have the perfect answers on that front. It's a work in progress. I think one thing that I try and be mindful of is I am not my job. Like oftentimes we tend to be like, I am a program officer here, or I am a director of this entity. And I think like you work as that, but that's a temporary role. It's a hat you wear. It's a seat you have at a table. That table may not be there forever. You may give up the seat to someone else. You may be displaced, or there may be no seat in a few years. So we navigate through life in these roles where we contribute to a mission, but we aren't that institution. And I think that's important to have for our sense of well-being. I think for people who are in the funder space, really important to say it's not my money. I see so many people in philanthropy who, operate from a sense of arrogance or a sense of entitlement. And really, we have to say that these funds are in the public trust to advance the public good. And we are stewards of that. We don't have all the answers. We have to be open to different perspectives. So I think, having some mindset shifts internally can help us grapple with that sense of our role in the space and in society. I see a comment in the chat which says that institutions often fail to provide that support. And yes, I think sometimes crises hit and institutions focus on protecting the institution as opposed to protecting the people. And so it's really incumbent on folks during the times when they aren't crises to think about how do you set up those systems and policies and protections. And then when crises happen, to ensure that, the priority is not just the protection of the institution, it's also the protection of the people who work there to advance the mission.
Yes, I mean, these are really challenging issues. And thanks, Lajwanti. I think you're based in Pakistan, but I could be wrong, for the comment. And I will say, this is not startup. This is not philanthropic, but 776, run by Alex Ohanian, the co-founder of Reddit, who's married to Serena Williams. They have a foundation, and they also do venture investing. And one of the really interesting things in the venture investing is they build in a certain percentage of the funds they give to their startups for founder well-being. So they're very transparent on that and helping, because also in the startup culture, we do small scale angel investing. There's so much emphasis on like build and work 1 million hours a week and just leads to burnout. So I do think there's a lot of interesting lessons. And I have not worked for Human Rights Watch, and it's a very challenging job, but they tend, I don't know if it's for all employees, but I think if you've been there 5 or 6 years, you can get a paid sabbatical. Obviously academia, some people can get that, but and there's some places that provide retreat and well-being, but as you're saying, it's not just up to individuals, because the change-making industry can easily, we're all replaceable, and institutions often don't. A lot of people can get burnt out. It's happened to me. They burn out doing the work, and of course we have individual responsibility. There's a lot for institution, and I think sabbaticals, learning, days off, flexible work schedule. I mean, there's so much that can be done at the institutional level.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Like thinking about that, I've never had a sabbatical. It's like goal for the future, but I think that would be amazing where, organizations, I think it's good for the individual, but it's also good for the institution, right? Because you have to really think about how to build the infrastructure internally to get by when that particular person's out for like 2 months, right? So I think that's great. Hopefully it'll be more the norm in the future. But it also comes back to funding, right? Like funders can do that, but for nonprofits, often it's like, okay, somebody's got to pay for the sabbatical, somebody's going to pay for the professional development and training. And if you're surviving on grants that are time limited with specific areas of, like project support, I think, that becomes really challenging. And so it becomes incumbent of people who are funding these ecosystems to think about how these resources can be deployed for both impact, but also for that sense of institutional and individual well-being.
Yes. I mean, Rockefeller, I have friends who've been to Bellagio Center. I've never been, but obviously it's not just for philanthropy. If you're a change maker, usually mid to senior level, I don't know what the call for applications are open now. I don't know what the theme is for the coming year, but I think it's for a month in Italy at this amazing Rockefeller Retreat Center. And there are also foundations and others that provide those kind of things. But it would be wonderful, and not just for the staff, but for grantees, because I have a friend who ran a global INGO for years, and eventually, after a lot of planning and careful work, was able to carve out a sabbatical. But like it's almost like you have to cobble it together versus like it's built into the industry.
Mhm.
So the last two questions: is there any book or film or show that doesn't have anything to do with change making that you've recently watched or engaged with that you just think is fun or is occupying your brain in a good way that you might encourage people to read or watch?
Wow. Okay. That's a big, big question. I think one book that I would recommend that I finished reading late last year is called How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. And it's like really, really well written and very powerful, very well researched. And, it looks at a range of places across the United States and the legacy of slavery and what it means for society today. So I would highly recommend that.
Okay, thank you. And then the last question, both for you individually and for the foundation, what are the best channels to stay up to date on your individual work and the foundation? I mean, for you, is it LinkedIn, and does the foundation have a newsletter, or LinkedIn's best, or where
Yeah,
you
yeah.
recommend people?
For me, it's LinkedIn. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I have been sporadic in posting, but I'm planning to be better at it. I do a lot of job reshares and opportunities and occasional musings, but I'm hoping to be more deliberate in 2024. With the foundation, there is a periodic newsletter. There's a website with the blog. All of our grants are posted on the website in a pretty timely manner, so it's up to date. And the foundation is also on LinkedIn.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to share your wisdom and thoughts and questions, and also just recommendations both at the individual and institutional level. And again, really appreciate it. Please follow Sushma on LinkedIn. Check out the Heising-Simons Foundation. Either follow them on LinkedIn or subscribe to our newsletter. If you like the podcast, please consider rating it and search across the 135 other episodes, including a bunch from recruiters. And thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. And thank you everyone for joining us from around the world. Thank you so much. Just